So, as I mentioned, Thursday, the midterm will be made available. You will have until Monday, end of day, to turn that in. It will be 5 essay questions. I'll ask you to respond to 3 of the 5 essay questions. You can choose whatever 3 you would like. Um, it's important that you answer the questions in their entirety. There may be one question with about 3 to 4 different sub questions within it. Make sure you answer every single component of that question. You'll also be asked or required. Actually, let me just double check something real quick. But we don't have a theoretical framework in this class. So don't worry about that. So just make sure that you answer each of the questions in their entirety. Typically, for those who do not do well on my midterm, it's a byproduct of not giving yourself enough time, right? You're rushing at the last minute, and because you're rushing at the last minute, you're not answering the questions in their entirety. And that's typically what trips people up on the midterm. Outside of that, you do fairly well. I suggest, right, taking a day to do a question. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. That's 4, really Monday too, if you want. You have the full day. It's 5 days that you have to get the midterm back to me. If you take one question per day, that's 3 days of the 5 that you're attacking the midterm. That gives you 2 days to do your editing and to make sure that it's the way that you would like it to look and sound, and then you get the midterm back. If you go about it that way, there's no way that you would feel rushed. You'll feel unprepared or out of time. Along with your midterm, your journals will also be due. There will be a section on Canvas that you'll submit your midterm. You'll also be able to turn in your journals. Where you submit the journals, I'll have a list of the journals that are due and how many are due, right? I don't have off the top, I don't know what it is off the top of my head right now, but when you do submit that by next Monday, there will be a list of what journals I'm expecting for you to turn in and how many there are. Your journal should be composed of a thesis, an analysis, a contemporary analysis, and questions. This should not be new to anybody. Again, I argue that the questions are the most important aspect of your journal, probably more so than any other of the 3 components. So please make sure you have questions and make sure you're placing great energy and effort on those questions. Any questions that anyone has about anything we've done so far this semester? All right. So what we'll do today is go through the study guide. How we go through this study guide is totally up to y'all. We could go through and answer the questions and go through it very methodically that way, or we could just I could just run through what's on there, and then we call it a day and circle back on Wednesday, and then we could address any question that you all may have. But this time is dedicated solely to getting you all prep for your midterm, making sure you all feel comfortable about your midterm. So this will be what you need it to be. All right. I'm gonna pull up the study guide. So the study guide is kind of broken up into the readings that we've had throughout the semester. Um, Again, can I emphasize enough, right? Make sure you're answering these questions in their entirety. Don't leave off one component of the question because that's going to cause you to lose points. So actually, before I even get into that, just so I can know how we'll move through this, please let me know how you want to proceed. Do you want to take the time to answer the questions, or would you like me just to kind of go through the study guide and leave you all at your own devices to prepare yourself the way that you see fit? For those who would like to answer the questions, let me know. Okay, one person. So I got about 5 people, 6 people. All right, it looks like the majority would like to answer questions. So here's the thing. I'm not going to be answering the question. That's for y'all to answer the questions, right? This is your study guide. I know this shit. I wrote the midterm. So it's going to really be about you guys being able to answer the questions as best as possible. So I'm going to need your engagement to help answer these questions. All right. Okay. So here we are. One of the first things that we've covered this semester were kind of providing you a context of who African people were, right? And I argue that it's hard. I don't think it's wise for us to go about researching material on Africana studies or Pan-Africanism without knowing who African people are, right? So these first few bullet points are rooted in that discourse. Exactly how old are African people and why is this information significant for understanding history? Name two significant African individuals and their contributions prior to European conquest or the inception of modernity. So you can see from here is about like at least three separate questions embedded into that one question, right? How old are African people? Why is this information significant to understanding history? Naming two African individuals and their contributions, right? So at least four sub questions within that one question. So if you tell me how old African people are, but you don't tell me why that information is important, but you name for me two African individuals and their significant contributions, you've gotten three of the 4 points, right? So this is what I say, and this is what I mean when I say, like, please take the time to make sure that you answer the questions in their entirety. So how old are African people? Really, there's three acceptable answers based off of the lecture that we had at the first week of the semester. How old would you approximate African people to be?
Wasn't there like was African people basically like from like the beginning of time, almost like Christianity, like
Mm-hmm. Yes. So to be more specific, right, within that lecture, I gave you three dates or variations of these dates, right? 3.2 million years with the discovery of Lucy, or what we call Abiomi, right? We also had 7 to 8 million years, right? But the most accurate answer is unknown. And this is what kind of Imani is speaking to. The most accurate answer is unknown because the further that you dig into history, the more that you excavate the earth, the older African people become, right? So again, there's three acceptable answers: 3.2 million years old, 7 to 8 million years old, or the more accurate answer being unknown, due to the fact the more that you research, the more that you dig, the more that you excavate, the older African people become. Those are three acceptable answers for how old African people are. So why is this information significant to understanding history? Why does it matter how old African people are as it pertains to understanding history?
Isn't it so that you would understand like how what's the word I'm looking for? I forgot the word I'm looking for. Like how concepts certain ways are now. I feel like I know the word, but I'm like forgetting the word. Like the concept of like where schools and stuff came from, how African people are today, etc. Stuff like that.
Is that you're looking for civilization? Is that the word you're looking for? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So what I'm hearing from you, Imani, is it allows you to understand the origins of civilization. Okay. Amara, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just to add to what Imani said, so that we can know our roots, and we also need to understand that we were an indigenous people, and that as a people with stolen or um, kind of hijacked culture, we have to be able to maintain and honor that true origin of um, sustainability that allowed us to build civilization in the first place. I think that once we understand that, as an indigenous people, we did create community not communities but we were very civilized. We were kings and queens, we can kind of use those as metaphors for our roles and our positions in society today as activists, as students, as mothers, as fathers. You know, we're those same highly intellectual people who are not indigenous. We are enslaved and, abused in other ways, or we are experiencing other disparities. But we have to be able to use it as we have to know the origins of our history and how long ago those things happened, so that we can use it as a framework for what we're experiencing and how we will overcome in today's society.
So I think we have two frames of looking at this, right? Imani provides us with a broader contextualization if we're thinking about the question, right? As it pertains to history, and under it pertains to the historical origins of civilization, you must know what's called the radix point, which is Africa. Amara gives us to us from a more introspective standpoint in the space of as Black folks, right? For the Black folks in the class, as African people for the African people in the class. This provides us with a framework of who we are as a people as we seek to move our struggle forward. So state for me the names of two African individuals and their significant contributions prior to European conquest or prior to the inception of modernity. So again, thinking to that same lecture, I gave you a list of African individuals and some of their phenomenal contributions. I'm looking for two of those individuals and what they did that was significant.
Well, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correct, but Narmer, which I believe is the Kemetic pharaoh in the early dynasty period.
Yep, and he's also famous for the unifier of Kemet, right? He unified Upper and Lower Kemet. Thank you, Olivia. Let's get one more. Significant African individual prior to European conquest or the inception of modernity.
Imhotep, I think that's
yep.
He was really basically known for being like later, but he was basically being a medical demigod because he was a physician, like the first physician.
Yep, perfect. Thank you, Imani. All right, so that is the lecture we had on who are African people, right? But again, what I cannot overemphasize is when you're thinking about this question or this first bullet point, right, which could serve as a model for one question, you must answer these questions in their entirety, right? Like if you leave off any aspect or component of that question, you will not get the full points. Okay, so moving to the second bullet point, looking at the teachings of Ptahhotep. What's significant about the teachings of Ptahhotep, the oldest book in the world, as it pertains to the understanding who African people truly are? How does this text speak to the values and principles that shaped ancient African society? So there's two things that I'm looking for here, right? How does this book speak to who African people truly are, right? So within this notion of who they truly are, speaks to the fact that there's a misconception, right? And then also, what are the values and the principles that shaped African society based off what is being discussed in this book? So first and foremost, right, how does this text speak to who African people truly are? Let's think about it this way before I even answer that. What is the thesis of the teachings of Ptahhotep? What is the main objective of that reading?
I feel like that they want to strive in like a peaceful society, and it's based off of respect as well.
So you're spot on, Olivia. It's the desire to create a society that exists without strife, right? A strifeless society, a peaceful society. So this is the desire. This is the thesis of the text, right? This is why Ptahhotep delivers these wisdom teachings. So this is the intention behind the text. What does that intention say about who African people truly are?
I don't really know how to like say this a different way, but in a way they kind of had like their own sort of like morals. They had like a how do I say this? I don't know, like a high understanding of just things for themselves. But the only thing I can think of was like they just have like a high sort of like morals about.
So, which essentially what you're pointing us to, Imani, is a high moral standard, right? So this reading allows you to understand African people being a people with a high moral standard, right? And I think you're absolutely correct about that. What else? Anyone else? What does this reading say about these people? So we have high moral standards. What else? Are there people who are violent people?
Innately, no. Innately, we are depicted that way because of the conflict that exists between, Europeans and indigenous Africans or any other indigenous um, sufferer of, European terrorism. So I think that it is a stigma, it's a stereotype, and it's something that obviously with uh, realizing and learning the teachings of Ptahhotep, we know that um, we are intellectual. We have too much dignity. We know better. We are a race or a a, a African people. They just know better, and I think that we see that with his teachings because he's not talking about how there needs to be an end to black on black crime, or there needs to be an end to Africans hating one another, or the stereotypical um conversations that are had today. It's obvious that those things that we hear in our own media sources and black media sources are watered down and far away from the fact that we are actually not even, the majority of us are not even criminals, or the majority of us are not even violent criminals. And I think that his work just talks about overall being a peaceful person, overall being upholding these morals and these principles, and having a philosophy for respect to each other in general. It's not just about like black within the black society or within the black civilization. He's talking about in general altogether, and that kind of targets and disseminates the stereotypes that we get um, for being perceived as angry people who only talk about black power. With the Nation of Islam being labeled as black supremacists, and
Okay, let's pull it back up because we didn't know the teaching of the thought tap. So just from what I did grab from you, right? There's a principled people, right? There are people who are respectful. Um, they're intellectual, they're dignified, they're nonviolent people. They're people who engage with a high moral standard. Um, in regards to the notion of black on black crime, right? Where this does connect. The whole desire of the teachings of Ptahhotep is to eliminate the environment that would produce black on black crime, right? And this is why he gives us these 37 wisdom teachings that are really about avoiding conflict, right? So this is like the precursor to the elimination of a Black on Black crime. This predates even the idea of a Black on Black crime. This is a prevention more than it is an intervention on this notion of Black on Black crime. Okay, so with all that being said, what then becomes the values and the principles that shape this ancient African society, right? We know that they're principled people. So what are the principles, right? We know that they're a society with a high moral standard. What is that moral standard? So give me a little bit more nuts and bolts of some of the conceptualizations and some of the principles that shape this African society. Think about Ma'at and her role in shaping the society. What are the principles and the values of Ma'at, and how does that come into play with the teachings of Ptah? So again, what becomes the values that shaped the ancient Kemetic society that produced the teachings of Ptah, who seeks to create a society that is strifeless?
I don't know if this is how like you want the answer to be answered, but I feel like it speaks to like the values that they wanted to show that they were peaceful people, and it was based off of maintaining a society that like was just based around like no violence and peace. And I know there was like a lot of parts that highlighted wisdom and like passing that down, and it was also talking a lot about knowledge to pass down. So I feel like it was just based on peace and then gaining knowledge from and wisdom too, gaining knowledge and wisdom from like elders.
Yeah. So definitely we have to center peace in the conversation of what their value system is, right? If he's seeking to eliminate strife, then peace becomes the optimum practice. Absolutely about the sharing of wisdom and the passing down of knowledge, right? Also, if you think about some of the teachings themselves, right? Listening becomes of high value. That's something that's mentioned over, I think, 27 times within the wisdom teaching, the act of listening. He says, let me speak to the hearers who have listened to the words of the gods, right? So in high emphasis placed on the value of listening opposed to being the one who speaks. Value on elimination of the ego, right? If you are in a dispute with someone who is above you, fold your arms and bow. If you're in a dispute with someone who is your equal, fold your arms and bow. If you're in a dispute with someone who is below you, fold your arms and bow. All of this act of folding your arms and bowing is an act of eliminating or dispelling the ego, right? They talk about not following material possessions, right? So one of the things that they value as a society is not materialism, but spirituality, right? So these are some of the values that situate this ancient Kemetic society. Those values are being extracted through understanding what Ptah Hotep is speaking about, what he's articulating through the 37 wisdom teachings. Through what he's placing within that text lets you know what he sees of importance and how he wants this Kemetic society to operate, right? Okay, so moving on to stereotypes and destruction. Looking at William Harris's text, Africans and Their History, as well as Chancellor Williams' The Destruction of Black Civilization. So looking through the first bullet point, what is the thesis of Harris's text, Africans and Their History, the chapter, A Tradition of Myths and Stereotypes, be able to engage Harris's assertion of European expansion's greatest contribution to the New World? Think about the role religion, Christianity in particular, has played in shaping the view and image of African people. Be prepared to engage a discourse on the role some scholars play in trying to diminish African contributions to human civilization by displacing Kemet or Egypt out of Africa. So there's a lot to unpack within this particular question. So it's best to just break it down, right? So what is the thesis of the text? This text being Africans in their history, in particular the chapter traditions of myth, a tradition of myths and stereotypes. What is the thesis of that reading? It may be a good idea at this point to engage your journals for those who have your journals.
Harris argues about the spread of negative stereotypes and myths about African people, which are often like fueled by European civilization.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Right. So the thesis is articulating how these myths, these negative myths and these negative stereotypes of African people got spread predominantly right through European hegemony. So what does he claim is Europe's greatest contribution to the New World? So what did Europe contribute to the New World? That's the greatest contribution, according to Harris, right? Not our personal opinion, but within the text. What does he say is the greatest thing that Europe has done for the New World? And again, it's within the title of the chapter, right?
Was it Christianity?
Well, not necessarily, right? It's Christianity's ability to change the perception of Black people, right? And that's the greatest contribution, was Europe's ability to shift Black people from being viewed as gods, right, to being viewed as something that is inhuman. That's what he argues is Europe's greatest contribution. And if you even think about it from the way that the course is structured, right, we have the first week of material where we're learning about the greatness of Africa, right? Then you go into learning about the teachers of Ptah and the greatness of that ancient Kemetic civilization. Something happens to where that greatness is no longer maintained and we view African people differently, right? Harris is saying that shift is Europe's greatest contribution to the New World. To Brian's point, that shift happens predominantly through the auspice of Christianity, right? So, which is our next sub-question, right? Think about the role religion, in particular Christianity, has played in shaping the image of African people. So speak to some of the ways that Christianity was able to shape the way that we view African people.
So it would be like they implemented race into like the religion and their Bibles. And so like every like negative thing that happens in the Bible can be like contributed to African people.
Perfect. So Francisco says the contribution of race into the historic biblical discourse, right? And the reading gives us one specific rupture that the Bible in particular offers, and that's the curse of Ham, right? That's where Noah, I believe it's Noah, he's found by his sons drunk and unclothed. All the other sons seek to get him back sober and put clothes on him, whereas Ham laughs at him in his drunken state. Because of Ham laughing at his father in his drunken state, He is cursed with black skin, woolly hair, broad nose, broad lips, effectively becoming what we know as the black race, right? So this is one of the ways that religion and the Bible begin to shift the way that the world understands black folks, right? And one of these being the curse of Ham, right? The changing of the image of God, right? You know, from week 1 of the semester that it says within the very same Bible, let us create man in our image and after our likeness. We know that African people are the first people on the planet, right? So if this is true, then the image and the likeness of God must be someone of African descent. Just like we know in the book of Revelations, right, that God is described as someone with bronze skin and woolly hair, right? But in all of the depictions of God under the auspice of maternity, right, he does not look like that, right? So this is another way that Europeans were able to shift their perception of God, of African people by shifting the perception of God, right? Okay. So also be prepared to engage in a discourse on the role some scholars play in trying to diminish African contributions to human civilization by displacing Kemet out of Africa. So another way to think about what you just heard, right? In the text, he argues that there's a section of scholars, a section of intellectuals who argue that Egypt is not part of Africa, right? That Egypt is part of the Middle East and not, in fact, in Africa. So you should be able to talk about that. Why do they try to do that? What's the significance of trying to displace Egypt out of Africa? We argue that, you know, to know that African people are all these people in the world is to have an understanding of the origins of civilization, right? So what does it mean to then say that to say that Egypt, which is argued as one of the origins of civilization, is not an African byproduct? But talk to me about that. Well, Martin, why do you think that some scholars try to remove Egypt out of Africa?
Why did some? Oh, because they don't believe like their beliefs. Like for example, the pyramids within like the stars and how they structure together, and that they created astrology and stuff like that.
Okay, so you're saying they don't want to believe that, but why don't they want to believe that is the question.
I mean, because it's a lot to take in, and
there you go.
yeah, it's a lot to take in, and what's it called?
Diego, help him out.
Yeah.
Why do you think scholars want to say that Egypt is not a part of Africa? We can't hear you, Diego. You're saying something, but we can't hear you. Yeah, still can't hear you, man. You may want to log out and log back in and see if your audio is able to connect, because I hear you, I see you talking, and you're off of mute, but I can't hear you. Eva, why do you think some scholars want to move Egypt out of Africa?
I think because they want to keep them like within that stereotype.
Yeah, very much so. Martin, go ahead. You're on mute, Martin.
Is it because of their religion?
Well, I think Eva is kind of pointing us closer to the right direction, right? Because you cannot say that these people are inhuman. You cannot say that these people are inferior, right? but at the same time say that these people built civilization. It won't work. So in order to keep us within this stereotype and within these myths, you say that, well, that part is not really Africa. That's Northern Africa, which is actually part of the Middle East. And the people who created the pyramids, they weren't really African people. They're more of like an Arabic type of people, right? So what you're trying to do is to diminish the role of African people in creating civilization. That way you can justify the way that you continue to treat these people. Does that make sense? Do you all understand why it's important for some scholars to remove Egypt out of Africa? Because if Egypt is, no one argues that Egypt is the mother of civilization, right? But what they argue is who created this civilization? Who created this civilization called Egypt, right? And that's where the debate comes in. And this is why they try to maneuver and say that this was not an African invention. This was a Arabic invention. This was a Semitic invention, right? This is all in attempts to diminish African people's ability to build civilization so they can continue to subjugate African people. All right. So moving into the destruction of Black civilization in the work of Chancellor Williams. How does Williams present his thesis in the opening chapter of The Destruction of Black Civilization? Think about the effects of fragmentation and isolation. Think about the effects fragmentation and isolation had on African nations and how were forms of African communication forever changed. Think about the roles Arabic invasion and enslavement, along with the migrations of Asian and later European migrants, led to the mixing of African nations, and what were the effects of this mixing. All right, so one, not necessarily what was the thesis of the destruction of Black civilization, but how does Williams give us his thesis? What is his approach to delivering his thesis? Because again, you want to make sure you're answering the question the way it's being phrased, right? So if you're reading this carefully, the question is, how does Williams present his thesis? Not asking you what's the thesis. So again, we could talk about what the thesis is, but what the question is asking you is, how do you understand? How does Williams get you to understand his thesis? Is he giving you historical examples? Is he talking about the land mass? Is he talking about the topography of these spaces, right? Is he talking about the natural phenomenon that caused the migration to take place? These are the hows of his thesis. So again, how does Williams deliver his thesis in the opening chapter?
I feel like he talks about how they use the Nile River, and so they already had like prior knowledge, and he talks about what they did and how he gives proof basically that they did have knowledge and understanding of how to navigate the waters.
So Olivia points us to topography, right? The Nile is one of those ways. And then providing a historical account, providing historical record, providing historical truth and proof to what he's arguing is how he goes about arguing or producing his thesis. Absolutely. So think about the effects of fragmentation and isolation on African nations. So what were the effects of fragmentation, of being fragmented, right, of being broken apart? And then because of you being broken apart, you become isolated from your former groups, right? And then how did this impact forms of African communication? So what are the roles of this fragmentation and this isolation? First of all, what produces the fragmentation and isolation? We can start there. Why does African nations become fragmented and isolated? Yesenia, I'm sorry, go ahead. Who else gonna speak? Go ahead.
I think that maybe they probably felt like African people were just too strong as like a unit. So they probably decided to like break them up into, I don't know, like different, or send them off to like different areas to keep them from like coming together in a way.
Okay. hopefully this will help you think about or remember what was discussed. He talks about how African people had the ability to build these very large cities, right? And we know that because they built the pyramids. But he says that doesn't make very much practical sense. What made more practical sense was the ability to build little huts that you could tear down and build back up, tear down and build back up. Why would you need to tear down huts and build them back up? What are you fleeing from? What is causing African nations to flee or migrate out of Kemet, which causes them to build small huts that could be tore down and reconstructed quickly and easily, opposed to very large mass buildings and cities?
I think they're seeing like random people showing up to wherever they're living, and they're, they're either trying to do some sort of destruction or anything, and they're just want to have like an easy way to just like pick up and move.
Yes. So you're right, Imani, but to be more specified in the random people, right? It was one, nature, right? Nature was causing them to migrate. Two, the Arabic invasion, the Arabic slave trade that came out of the East forced African people further west and further south. To avoid the enslavement, they built small huts that could be easily torn down and easily reassembled as they migrated to avoid Arabic invasion and the Arabic slave trade, right? Enslavement trade. So that is why there's this fragmentation and isolation. Again, if it's 50 of us and we're all a group, right? And you know that you are trying to flee from enslavement, it may be more prudent, it may be wiser to break up in groups of 5, right? Than to all try to travel as 50 people. So as we're breaking up in groups of 5, we're becoming fragmented, right? But as we're a collective 50, we all spoke the same language, right? But as we broke up into groups of 5 and we start to spread out over time, our language changes, right? So now we go from being one linguistic group, right, to 10 separate linguistic groups because of us being fragmented, right? So this is the effect of language on the African continent due to the migration, the fragmentation, and the isolation, right? Africa has the most languages in the world. This is due by and large to the fragmentation that is a byproduct of the migration. I've kind of talked about the Arabic invasion already, right? And Arabic enslavement, but also linking the migration of Asians and Europeans and the mixing, right, that took place with the African nations. What were the effects? What were the after effects or the byproducts of the mixing that took place from the Arabic invasion, the European invasion, and Asian invasion? What were the byproducts of this mixing? So again, we're talking about the destruction of Black civilization. We're talking about how this ancient Kemetic civilization gets eroded and destroyed. He argues that, one, we already talked about, right, how the Arabic invasion and the Arabic enslavement trade forced African people to migrate south and west. He talks about how Asians and Europeans began to migrate into Kemet and begin to mix with the Kemetic people. What happens? What are the byproducts, or what are the after effects of that mixing? How does this mixing lead to the destruction of Black civilization?
The loss of cultural identity.
Okay, perfect. Expand on that if you can, Brian, or somebody help expand on that a little bit more. How does this mixing, which leads to a loss of cultural identity, lead to the destruction of Black civilization?
There were like, well, Christianity, the African people were forced into like a certain religion, and if not being into like one of those chosen religions like Christianity, that led to being sort of like outcasted, which could also lead into like their identity, like the their the destruction of their like identity psychologically.
Okay. So what he argues in the text, right? If an Arabic man impregnates an African woman, the child of that pregnancy identifies not with the mother, but with the father, right? So that child doesn't say that I'm African, it says that I'm Arabic. So when wars kick off, that child is not going to fight for his mother. He's going to fight on the side of the Arabic invaders. So this is how the culture begins to get eroded, because they identify with the father opposed to the mother. So when it comes time for war, their allegiance is with the invader opposed with the indigenous people or the indigenous African whose soil it is, right? So that not only produces a cultural erosion, but from a numeric standpoint, now there's having more people, right? There's more numbers on the side of the invaders because their offsprings are fighting with them. This is how that mixing produces the destruction of Black civilization. This is how you could argue that Kemet is not an African civilization, it's an Arabic civilization, because over time, the blood begins to get diluted and the people of that area don't look African, they begin to look more Arab, right? So from a phenotypical standpoint, it looks like everybody in Egypt is Arab, right? That's due to this mixing that Williams is pointing us to. We're going to put a pause on that for today here.